Welcome everyone to our online event facing the challenges of remote learning, how to assess your students. My name is Andressa Carmo, I'm the head of English at Colégio Santo Anjo, and we'd like to thank you in advance for participating today. This event was organized together with Cultura Inglesa, represented here by Marina. Hi Marina!
Hello Andressa. The first session will be presented by Alberto Costa, Senior Assessment Service Manager Americas for Cambridge Assessment English, who gladly accepts our invitation. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Welcome, Alberto.
I'm going to share my screen now so that we can start the presentation. Everyone, thank you very much for attending this presentation. In this part, we are going to talk about assessing students during remote learning. Here are some of the points we are going to talk about. We will present a range of assessment practices, and we are going to talk about how they can be adapted for remote learning. And also, we are going to see how you can help your students become more autonomous and confident about their achievement. And of course, we are going to talk about some concepts and practical ideas for your assessment toolbox. We are also going to do we are also going to ask you some questions. And during the presentation, we have a quiz as well. So I'm going to be checking your answers in the chat here in YouTube, okay? So thank you very much once again for your presence. And here we are going to start. So in order to warm us up for this session, what kind of assessment practices have you adopted in your remote teaching? We know that many institutions are starting the academic year again remotely. We used a lot of techniques and practices for assessment last year in our remote teaching, emergency remote teaching. What kind of practices have you been using or have you adopted in your remote teaching to assess your learners? Can you share some thoughts and ideas here in the chat, please? What kind of assessment practices have you adopted in your remote teaching? Okay, let me see if we get some ideas in the chat. Okay, I can see my dear friend and colleague Fabricio, who also comes from my hometown, Recife. Fabricio says, using Google Forms a lot. Okay, well done. Okay, very good. A lot of you have mentioned Google Form. Okay, can I ask you a question? Can you see the PowerPoint screen on YouTube or only my face? Okay, quizzes, video recording evaluations. Very nice, Luis. We are going to talk about some of those things as well. Okay. Okay, fillable, Google Forms and different quizzes. Okay, very nice. Yes, because of this emergency remote teaching, like I mentioned, we have been using a number of activities and resources and tools to assess learners, right? So because of this situation we are currently in, we can see that many of us teachers have been facing a number of challenges with teaching, learning, and assessment. And I think one advantage that we have now is that we have been learning a lot from the experience last year. But we still have some questions considering all those uncertainties in our scenarios, whether or not we are back to classes. So we have questions in our minds that reflect things like, how much did students learn during the emergency remote teaching? So how much learning has taken place during this time? Have the students learned just as much as they would have learned otherwise? Another question that we have is, how far can we go this year, this school year, with our learners? Considering all the experiences that we gathered, that we developed last year, how far can we go this school year? What kind of objectives can we set, and whether or not we need to make adjustments to those expectations? So this is a question that it is a thinking question. You might wish to share some ideas in the chat. Do you and do your learners have a clear picture of where you are and how well you are doing, considering the program you have to follow? And also, another question, what about the learning objectives? As I mentioned before, because of all the adjustments we have been having to make, we may need to consider the learning objective and make decisions in terms of how much to cover, or whether or not these needs more or less to include in our objectives, right? Okay, so when you think of those questions that I'm talking about, how much did students learn during emergency remote teaching? How far can we go this school year? Do you and your students have a clear picture of where you are? And how about your learning objectives? How confident are you in answering those questions as a teacher, right? So you can go to the chat now on YouTube, and you can answer the question, say whether you are very confident. So you type letter A, very confident, letter B, quite confident, letter C, not sure, and letter D, not confident. So A, B, C, D. A, very confident, B, quite confident, C, not sure, and D, not confident in relation to the question, how confident are you in answering the questions the teacher is thinking about? So you can start answering the questions using the letters A, B, C, or D, right? So I can see some letters coming here. So if you just type the letter, I can understand what they mean here. So A, very confident, B, quite confident, C, not sure, and D, not confident. Okay, I can see a quite confident teacher typing here, which is very nice. Any other answers that you can add here? So how confident are you in answering the questions the teacher is thinking about? How much did students learn during emergency teaching? How far can we go this school year? Do you and your learners have a clear picture of where you are? And what about the learning objectives? How confident do you feel about the questions? A, B, C, or D? That's very nice, very nice. I can see a very positive picture with teachers feeling quite confident. And I think this is very good feedback for us, and it's very good feedback for our peers here, our colleagues, and our institutions, uh, because of all the experience from last year, we have been definitely learning quite a lot, right? So Dennis is the most confident teacher here. He's very confident about answering those questions, which is very nice. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is in relation to assessment. Many of you, or perhaps most of you, use the Cambridge exams as one of the references and goals that you set for your learners. And one of the things about the Cambridge exams is that the exams aligned to this international standard, which is the Common European Framework of Reference. So the Common European Framework of Reference, which is now, this year, celebrating 20 years of existence, has caused this major impact in language learning and teaching, as well as assessment. And it gives us all these clear, measure or standards of what objectives we can and need to set, and how to best take our students to meet those objectives, right? So the CFR, as you know well, it has 6 major levels from A1 to C2. But because of this period of existence, 20 years now, last year, the Council of Europe launched an updated version of the CFR, and which is called the companion volume. And this updated version has a lot of changes and additions in terms of language competencies that have been added to this document, right? Our notion of levels has been a bit more fragmented. So we now have levels officially called pre-A1, and we have broken down levels like A2, A2 plus, B1, B1 plus, and B2, B2 plus. Why am I giving you all these explanations about the levels and the Cambridge exams? The Cambridge exams, they allow for a series of exams which form this progression and these milestones along the way. So instead of looking at a long road, not knowing where it ends, you have milestones. That is, you have specific points of progress that you can monitor through the CFR levels and through the exams, right? And this is about also celebrating those moments when we achieve certain levels, yeah? So I'm going to stop here because I'm going to give you a task, right? I'm going to give you some questions which are part of a quiz, and then you have to answer the questions in the YouTube chat. You can see the screen now. So the name of the game is very popular in the language classroom. It's called True or False, right? And then I'm going to give you the first question, and you're going to answer with 2 letters. A, if it's true. B, if it's false, okay? A or B. First question. Cambridge English qualifications encourage continuous progression with a clear path to improve language grammar. Is that true or false? So you can type A or B, okay? So first question, Cambridge English qualifications encourage continuous progression with a clear path to improve language grammar. Is this true or false? Let me check some answers here. True or false? They encourage continuous progression with a clear path to improve language grammar. Yeah? A or B? What do you think? Okay, I can see some answers coming up here. Good. And here is the answer to you, right? Cambridge English qualifications encourage continuous progression with a clear path to improve language skills. So this is not a true answer when we're talking about grammar only. Of course, we value when learners learn grammar and they learn vocabulary, they need grammar and vocabulary in order to communicate well and accurately. However, when the learners sit the exams, they will be assessed in their language competencies. So they have to show that they have the skills and the sub-skills developed, right? Because there won't be an item in the exam that is about specific grammar items, for example. It's all about using the language, right? Now I have a second question for you. So you can start typing A or B. A for true, B for false. Question 2 is, we have a range of free teaching resources, lesson plans, and activities to help you prepare your students for our exams and tests. Is that true or false? We have a range of free teaching resources, lesson plans, and activities to help you prepare your students for our exams and tests. True or false? You can type the question, you can type the answers here in the chat. Okay, I can see a lot of participation. Thank you very much. So the answer to this question is actually true. We are going to talk about some of those resources in a moment. Now, question 3. Each exam focuses on a level of the Common European Framework, helping learners to improve their speaking, writing, listening, reading, and listening skills step by step. Is that true or false? That's going to be fairly easy because we have been talking about those levels. So the answer to this will be true, right? So focusing on the different skills. And now I have a final question, which is question 4. And the question is, speaking and writing weigh more than reading and listening in the Cambridge exams. Is this A, true, or B, false? So for question 4, is that true or false? So type your answers in the chat. Okay, very good, very good. I can see some answers coming through, very nice. Okay, question 4. Speaking and writing weigh more than reading and listening in the Cambridge exams. Is that true or false? Okay, and the answer is very good, it's false. Actually, all the 4 skills, they have equal weight in the Cambridge exams. And when you have the use of the English component for the more advanced exams, it also has equal weight compared to the other skills, right? So well done, everyone. Thanks for participating. And now I did this quiz to check your knowledge of the Cambridge exams, to have an idea of what we can do in terms of learning objectives when we think about assessing learners in this remote context, right? So there are some bits of information about learning objectives that we'd like to share with you. Cambridge has existed for a long time, and it has a lot of research to back up a number of, beliefs. One of the beliefs is that preparing for the exam improves learners' English. So how can they prove that, considering all those decades of experience? Well, first of all, there is a target to aim for when we are preparing for an exam, and this target is internationally understood now. I mentioned that at the beginning, the CFR is now 20 years old, an adult, and because it is internationally understood, this target is described in full detail. So having a target or a series of targets, as we can see here in the image, it's good, it's vital for improving motivation, right? Also, when we think about taking the different exams, it's not just a case of level, but it's a detailed description of competencies in the 4 skills, which helps us teachers to plan long-term. It helps us to structure the syllabus so that we can best take learners to the different goals along the way. And the language that we are expected to cover, they focus on the 4 skills, and we follow a communicative approach. As I said at the beginning, learners will not be assessed in discrete grammar items, but in how they use the language in different situations, okay? So now, one of the things that the CFR talks about, and this is important for assessment, is all those descriptors, which are also known as can-do statements. I have one example of a can-do statement, and I have a question for you. What skill does this statement relate to? Is it about listening, reading, writing, or speaking? So please feel free to use the chat to type your answer. The descriptor is can understand letters of the English alphabet when heard. What skill does this statement relate to? Can you type your answers in the chat? Very good. Okay, I can see the answers. It's about listening. And now I have another question for you. And the question is, I have a table here which has many more descriptors. And the question is, what skills do these statements relate to? Look at the question on the right. Is it about listening and reading, listening and speaking, letter B, or listening and writing, letter C? Letter A, B, or C for this question? Let's see. Have a quick look through the can-do statements and decide whether it is A, B, or C, right? For this. Excellent. I can see some answers coming through. And the answer to this is letter B. We are talking about listening and speaking here. Well done, everyone, for the participation. And now I have a final question related to the can-do summary, which is, if you look at this list of descriptors, which level do they relate to? B1, A2, A1, or pre-A1, A, B, C, or D? Look at the question on the right and then type your answers there using A, B, C, or D. Okay, very good. Very good, everyone. Thanks for the participation here. Okay. Okay, more answers coming through. So the answer, well done, everyone. So the answer is yes, those descriptors are about levels is about the level pre-A1, right? You can see here that the level pre-A1 is aligned to one of the exams, which is pre-A1 starters, the young learners exams. But why are we talking about descriptors? It's because when we think about learning objectives, we need to understand what exactly we want to achieve by the end of the academic year or by the end of the first semester, so that we can consider how we are going to assess the learners. This is going to give us the basis, and then consider the format, the tasks, the activities through which we are going to be assessing learners between now and the end of a period in our academic year, right? So information about those can-do statements. Those can-do statements that we worked with a moment ago, they come from this list or this can-do summary from our handbooks for teachers. Each of our exams, they have a specific, a dedicated handbook for teachers. And one of the useful things about the handbook is that they have summarized the key can-do statements for each level, right? Because the original document of the CFR has a long list of items, so we need to prioritize. Those ones in particular, they come from the handbook for teachers for starters, movers, and flyers, right? Pre-A1. But you can also access those handbooks in the preparation area for the exams by, for example, scanning this code here or typing the tiny URL tiny.cc/handbooks. This is going to give you access to this area which we call exam preparation, and click on one of the rectangles and then you will find the handbook for the exam you are working with or you plan to work with this semester. And in the handbook, you will access the can-do summary for each of the exams, right? So this is one example of the starters can-do summary. And when we look at can-do summary for a higher level, for example, B2 level, which is B2 first exam, we see that we have different sections here. We have some typical abilities divided in sections like overall general abilities, social and tourist, and work. And we also have other sections here to look at. I'm bringing those can-do summaries for you because this is something we can use as an example of an assessment sheet for our learner, an assessment tool. Look at the descriptors that we worked with. If we put them on a table like that, We can, for example, consider when we set tasks to learners and observe the learners performing the tasks, we can decide how close they are to the expected level or the expected performance. So this is one way of using it. We have the can do statements on the table. We have the students' names, and then we can start observing the learners to see how well they are performing the tasks in the different skills, and then decide how close they are to the target, right? This is very nice because by completing a table like this, you can make decisions in terms of interventions. Should I should I bring more listening activities? Should I set more speaking activities? Should I help learners with this item of grammar so they can, for example, describe a story in the past simple? This is an idea. And I have here a present for you. If you scan this code here, or if you type the tiny URL, you'll be able to access those tables that I put together using the can-do summaries of the handbooks for teachers. You will find those tables from levels pre-A1 all the way to level B2, and I'm sharing them in Google Sheet format because you can, for example, either use them as they are, or you can adapt them to your specific learning objectives. So let's say that your students will only be sitting an exam next year. You can make changes to those tables and include your learning objectives for the semester and use this as an instrument to observe students to see how close they are to the pedagogical targets that you set for them, right? In terms of the different skills. So this is one idea that we can use to observe learners and assess them remotely. When you access the QR code or the tiny URL, you will see here a list of those tables that you can download, or you can save a copy for your own drive and use them or make copies of them to use with your learners. So this is one idea to work with. It's because when we look at those can-do tables, the way they have been grouped, we make sure that we are focusing and we are assessing learners having in mind those three core areas within the area of communication, which is, for example, using appropriate language and register for context. So if students have to tell a story, is the language appropriate? Is the range of vocabulary appropriate for the level, for the story, etc.? At higher levels, can they use different registers, formal, less formal, neutral, etc.? Another area of communication that we can see embedded in those can-do statements, managing conversations. Can learners, for example, listen and communicate effectively? Can they sort of gently interrupt the conversation? Do they know when they should start their turn in the conversation? In the case of written communication, can they quickly respond and effectively respond to a message, to a letter, etc.? And also in making sure that learners are participating with appropriate and confidence clarity, which is another key area of communication. It's not just about knowing a lot of vocabulary and grammar, but making sure that when you put those things together, you communicate confidently and, of course, clearly, and make yourself intelligible and understood by the audience. Someone at the other end of a letter, a message on the mobile phone, or in face-to-face or online communication, right? Okay, this leads us to consider skills and knowledge. This is something also that we need to bear in mind before we start assessing the learners, making sure that they need to develop the skills, but they need knowledge in order to perform language. So here we have an example of skills and knowledge, right? I have here a descriptor, a can-do statement at A2 level, and it is in the area of addressing audiences. So the descriptor reads, learners should be able to give a short rehearsed presentation about something. I put my family as an example, and briefly give reasons and explanations for their opinions, plans, and actions, right? Look, we are talking about level A2, which is, say, elementary level, right? But in order for them to perform this and demonstrate they have developed this competence, they need knowledge, specific knowledge. So they need knowledge, for example, of contextual vocabulary, and they need pronunciation skills. They need knowledge of adjectives, including possessive adjectives and their position, right? They need knowledge of some simple verbs, including be and have in the present tense for this specific task. They need, of course, to develop presentation skills. They need this knowledge of how to put a presentation together. And they need knowledge of how to express and justify a simple opinion, right? So all those things related to knowledge are points that we can see in our course books, for example, in our workbooks, and in the activities that we set learners. So when we practice new vocabulary, when we practice the pronunciation of specific words, it's important to bear in mind that we are building knowledge in order to make learners in specific skills, right? To demonstrate performance in specific areas. Similarly, we need to develop those things, making sure that we have skills and knowledge in writing skills. Again, we are working with the level A2, and the descriptor reads, at this level, learners should be able to write very short, basic description of events, past activities, and personal experiences. So in order for them to do that, we need to practice knowledge with learners. So they need knowledge of vocabulary, of course, and they need to know how to spell the words. They need knowledge of adjectives, including possessive adjectives in their position. They need knowledge of simple verbs at this level, including be and have in the past tense. They need knowledge of how to sequence events, organize the events, and link them with basic connectors. It's writing skills, so things like and, but, and because. They need basic text organization, for example, paragraphing, so how to put a simple paragraph together at this level. So what we are talking about here is that when you are practicing things, grammar and vocabulary with learners, think about how this will support them in developing those competencies that are described in the can-do statements, right? So not just thinking of those activities in isolation, but making sure that they can apply this in those descriptors. This is why I started by mentioning to you, if you have the descriptors as objectives, you can decide how close your learners are to those objectives, and it's one way of helping you with assessing them, right? Of course, when we think about activities, skills, etc., we need to know how we can assess. And in the classroom and in the remote classroom as well, it's very important that we prepare the assessment and share the assessment system or process with the learners, right? So here I'm going to give you an example of something that can be useful for different age ranges, for different levels, and you can just make adjustments to the specific levels and ages. They are called success criteria or rubrics, right? So basically, they can be as simple as a list of key points that you need to consider, or they can be more elaborate statements for assessment that would depend on the complexity of the activity or the level of the learners. So one good thing about success criteria is that they can be prepared by the teachers, they can be shared with learners. Learners can use them for both self and peer assessment as well. Also, another advantage is that when you prepare them, it's important to focus on positive aspects. So focus on the positive abilities to succeed, not focusing on what students cannot do, but focusing on what they can do, right? So it's important to prepare them based on what students should know, remember skills and knowledge, and also what students should be able to understand and be able to do. So based on those three things, what they know, what they understand and be able to do, we see here a combination of knowledge and skills. They help us teachers to decide whether the students have in fact achieved the learning intention of the activity, the task that you set, and they help to answer the same question from the point of view of the student. How will I know whether I have achieved my learning intention? How will I know that I did or that I did not do well in this activity, right? And finally, success criteria can be as simple as a series of points. And this is one example, an illustration that I brought here for you. One type of success criteria for level A2 designed for a speaking activity like describing a picture. So learners will be assessed in terms of describing where people are, 4 to 8 prepositions, describing what clothes people are wearing, and use 5 to 10 verbs in the present continuous correctly. So this is something that can be put together by teachers. This can be shared with learners. Depending on how you prepare the learners for this assessment, you can negotiate some points in the criteria that you can both teacher and students prepare together for the assessment of performance in one task, right? So this is one example. And here is something that we can apply this concept of success criteria. If you look at this slide here, we have 2 images, which immediately drives us to this task that we have in the speaking paper of B2 first exam, where learners need to compare and contrast 2 images and they have to talk for about a minute, right? So one thing that in terms of the activity, we can ask learners in remote lessons, for example, we can help them and give them instructions. For example, they need to set a timer for 1 minute. They need to prepare to record themselves. So making sure they practice with the language they see in the 2 images. They look at the pictures. In this case, we have people trying to win a sporting event. And then they talk about similarities and differences when they compare the 2 pictures. Set the timer, start the recording, and speak about the photos until the timer rings. And then they record themselves speaking for a few times. So it's usually when we do that as part of an activity in the classroom and in the remote classroom as well, it could be set for homework, for example. You might need to record this a few times until you are or until students are happy with the speaking and the recording, right? So if they practice by recording and then recording again, they are automatically using the language, practicing, repeating the language, developing their pronunciation, and becoming more critical as well of their performance. And then finally, they save their favorite recording to share with the teacher, right? Or this favorite recording could be part of an assessment process. For example, learners have completed their recordings, and then you can either set this for self or peer assessment. So learners can, for example, analyze their performance in terms of, did they speak for 1 minute? Did they pause or repeat themselves? How difficult it was? What went well in terms of grammar, pronunciation, organization of ideas, etc. And if they are working with or partner, they can exchange the recording and then they can do peer assessment, right? This can be done either with the support of the teacher or before they submit a final version for the teacher. This is a bit more elaborate because we are talking about level B2, but you can simplify this using bullet points, for example, if you are working with lower levels, right? As I said, success criteria is something that you can adjust according to level. So if we are thinking about more elaborate tasks, I mean, the speaking task for level B2 is quite elaborate in that sense. We can think of, for example, success criteria, which has descriptions of a number of different levels of performance in relation to the criteria, right? So here I have one example of rubrics for assessing writing at level B2. This one is more elaborate because it's not just points. We have subscales, for example, content, organization, and language. And here I have another example of the rubrics for assessing speaking skills at level A2. This is quite elaborate as well. Those scales, they come from the handbooks for teachers. Here we have subscales like grammar and vocabulary, pronunciation, interactive communication. This is not something that students would be able to work with at first. So my suggestion is that you start small, bullet points in the success criteria and gradually transform bullet points in descriptors, and maybe towards the end of the academic year or when they are close to the exam, you can work with something like this. I think the way it is here, it's more, I'd say, suitable for teachers. But of course, you can make adjustments if you are using them with learners. And learners usually appreciate when they understand how they are being assessed. And in remote teaching, it's very important that they know what the points are for assessment, so they can, when they are working on their own as well, decide how they need to improve this or that area in speaking or writing, etc. Yeah. So this is one idea. Of course, here you can create, if you think, for example, the rubrics are full of information and you want to prioritize statements or descriptors or points to consider, you can make your own rubrics. And here you will find a template. And there is a link that will take you to the guide for assessing writing skills where you can find this template. But you can see it's very easy to replicate in the computer, and you can create your own subscales and rubrics as well, just as and here we have an example of how to structure it. Yeah. So make it quite personalized, customized to your goals, to your learners, to their level, right? So it's something that before doing this path to which is preparation, you can be quite flexible. So learning objectives, when we recap what we have been talking about, it's important that when you are talking about learning objectives, make sure that you can answer the questions about your learners. So what are they learning? How are they learning it? How well they are doing, etc. And it's important as well that learners are able to answer those questions about themselves, right? So what are you learning? Why are you learning it? How well are you doing? And where do you need to go next? So making sure that you share the criteria with the learners is important. Of course, this is something that needs to start small. We need to train learners for this as well, right? So in terms of resources, I would like to go back to the handbooks for teachers, where you can find loads of information and you can transform some of the content into activities and, of course, assessment tools like I mentioned, with the tables, right? There are many more resources that you find when you go to the preparation area of our website, which is this link that I mentioned here. You will find the sample tests, the word lists for some of the exams, the can-do summaries we have been talking about, and of course, the handbooks for teachers. And we have many more resources available to you, like, for example, Sua Nova Sala de Aula de Inglês, which has sections for you to work, for you to access resources, download them, and use with your learners. And most of them will bring adjustments to remote teaching. Like, for example, when you go to this area, Recursos para Professores, you can download a series of new lesson plans that have been devised last year by our team in UK. And those lesson plans will bring this information here, online teaching. And what you find in them is what to do in your class if you want to use some of those activities. And it has on the right a column with online options for you to make adjustments to that activity in case you are teaching remotely, right? So additional support, we have our platforms Write and Improve, which gives learners feedback on their writing, and it's a very good tool because it gives feedback in relation to CFR levels. Like this is a project, in fact, it's a research project called Speak and Improve, form where learners can talk to this bot called Sandy, ask them questions, listen to them, and assess their speaking skills. So it's free, it's open, learners can use it in the computer or in the mobile phone, speakandimprove.com. Exam preparation planner, which we call weekly lesson planner, which you can access here. Again, it's free, and you can create a preparation plan from exams to pre-A1 starters all the way to B2 first, right? Excellent tool. And we have a number of things that you can use, which also brings ideas and activities for teaching and assessing, which are the classroom posters, right? For each level, there are 3 different topics related to those 3 different topics. Here are the posters for levels B2, B1, and each of these set of posters will come with those classroom activities booklets, which has ideas, and the ideas also bring adjustments to online teaching and learning. And we have the brand new posters for level B2, which focuses a lot on vocabulary, especially phrasal verbs for this level. Again, each poster will come with a booklet of activities, lots of ideas for you to use them with your classes, and the guides for assessing writing, which I mentioned, and you have a different guide for the different levels of the Cambridge exams. They are highly recommended, right? Well worth reading. We also have our apps, which allow for self-assessment. We have the exam lift apps for the levels A2 and B1 for exam preparation and self-assessment as well. And our Facebook portal, Cambridge English Teaching, right? I think I have some time for questions now, right, Andressa? Read the questions in the chat and address some of them with you. So, Andressa, let me look at the YouTube and see if there are any questions. Thank you, Fabricio, for your feedback on the tables. Thank you very much. Andressa, from the chat. If that's okay, I would just like to share the screen before I say thank you, because I have a present for the teachers. I mentioned a number of resources and a number of links. And for teachers to be able to access those resources and the links, I have a QR code through which they can download the slides that I presented today. So if that's okay, Enrique, if I could show them the QR code for them to access and download the slides that I presented, please. In the meantime, I'll be checking for questions. I have a question from Dennis here. So given the current difficulties, how do you think teachers can cope with the uncertainty of whether the exams happen or not? Dennis, I would like to start by saying this is the $1 million question, right? Exams are happening, they have been happening, but that would depend on local conditions and on local restrictions. So we have had situations where the exams have happened successfully, and we have had situations where exams had to be postponed because local restrictions wouldn't allow schools to open and wouldn't allow students to come into schools. So, what we are doing very, very closely to centers is monitoring whether or not the sessions are happening, making sure that all the candidates are informed well in advance if something needs to change or if the exam sessions need to be postponed. Yes, but there have been a number of yeah, initiatives in place. One of them is making sure that there are more dates for the exams, for example, and centers can inform the prep centers and the candidates about this, and that depends on the different locations. So what we can tell about one place, I'm in São Paulo at the moment, and depending on where you are in São Paulo, you have different restrictions. So we are monitoring very closely. Any more questions? Once again, everyone, by accessing this QR code, you'll be able to download all those slides that I presented today. And by all means, click on the links and ensure that you access this, all the materials that I presented, right? Okay. So let me go back to the chat just to make sure I have one more question. Any other questions, everyone? No? So, I would like to thank Colégio Santo Anjo to be talking to you, to Inglês, the authorized center who works with Colégio Santo Anjo for the exams. What we do in many ways, it's not just about the exams, but about good teaching and assessment practices in the classroom. So this is why we have so many resources available for teachers, right? I'm sure you're going to have a great session with Dennis. I'll be attending the sessions through YouTube. Thank you very much, Andres, and thank you very much, Marina, for this opportunity.
Now we invite you to watch Dennis Warren's workshop on how to foster autonomy in the classroom. Dennis is a teacher and speaking examiner to international exams, and we hope we can all learn from his techniques and expertise. Hello, Dennis.
Okay. Okay, awesome. We're sometimes having these little tricky problems, and let me explain the reason why. Is because there's a bit of a delay between when it appears on YouTube and when it appears for us live. So there's this little 20-second delay, and that's why sometimes we look like we're kind of looking into the distance or picking our nose or something like that. So bear with us, okay? It's a bit tricky. Okay. I'd like to thank you for having me come and talk to you. And I'd like to thank Colégio Santo Anjo and also Cultura Inglesa Curitiba for inviting me to talk. It's awesome to see so many familiar names. And it's also really nice to see some names from the past. I saw it a little while ago, for example, the name Evanda Fagundes online. And that's somebody who used to work with me at Cultura quite a few years ago. So that's also nice to see those names as well. Okay, so let's get on with it. We're talking about autonomy at the moment, aren't we? So this is our topic, and I assume that you're here because you're interested in or curious about fostering autonomy in your learners. And, you know, I always tell my learners that the secret Coca-Cola recipe to success is something that's very, very simple. It's curiosity. And curiosity is basically an interest in everything. By being curious about everything, you open yourself up to an amazing world of knowledge and experience. And, you know, I want to congratulate every single one of you for being here. After the year we've just had, it's amazing that you care for your learners so much and that you're still motivated to want to make their lives better. That in itself is a lesson in autonomy that you can teach your learners simply by being a teacher. But I do know that leaving it at that wouldn't be very popular, so let's move on with the show. Now, I just want to check if everybody can actually see my screen. Awesome. Okay. So, on with the show. Basically, before we actually begin, I have a question for you. And the question is, look at that picture. What is it? Now we're gonna try something in the chat for now. I don't know how well this is going to work because I said there is a delay in you seeing the video and me seeing the chat. So let's see if we can manage it. Do you know what that is in that picture? Now, I'm not sure if any of you have seen this photograph, but it is relevant to today's talk. And there is a relationship between this image, what this image represents, and the topic of today. And I promise you that if you stick around, you're actually going to be able to find out the answer, okay? So here's what we're going to do today. We'll be looking first at what makes for a successful autonomous learner, which can then guide us in thinking about ways of working that can help the learners to become more autonomous. Okay, now as we are meeting with exams in mind and we have about 50 minutes, I've tried to focus as much on that as possible. And the result of that is that perhaps some general things have been left unexplored. But I've left a reading and a resource list at the end of my slides, which we'll be distributing later on, okay? So the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we're actually all on the same page. And basically, we need to say what is autonomy in learning. And there are various definitions of this. And I think perhaps it's best for us to go back to the original source, the original definition of autonomy in learning, which is by Henry Holleck from the 1980s. He coined this term about autonomy in learning. And his idea is that an autonomous student or a learner is an individual who understands and takes responsibility for their own learning, and also that they're able to reflect upon the process they go through, and they're aware of the actions, strategies, and techniques they can use to enhance their learning. Yeah, but this is quite a lot in one single phrase, so we need to break it down a little bit in order to get to a place where we can actually start to get practical ways for our exam learners to improve their skills. We can do this by thinking about the skills and the behaviors of successful autonomous learners. So imagine you have an ideal autonomous learner, and then we're observing them for a little while. We need to think about what are their habits and their behaviors that make them so successful. And basically we're going to be looking at that and thinking about how they can be responsible, how can they reflect on and devise strategies for their own learning. Okay. And I'm going to focus on 4 behaviors, I think. Now, the first one, I put this one first because I think it's the most important, and these are strategies. Now, basically, strategies are when a learner develops knowledge of learning strategies. It means that they know how to learn, and they optimize their chances of learning by adopting good methods and good habits. One example might be creating a learning routine, so they know what they're going to do on a daily or even a weekly basis. And as we'll see in a moment, this can actually be broken down even further, but for now we'll keep it as it is. Yeah. Now there are actually other behaviors that we're going to be looking at, and then further on we're going to be exploring them. Basically, in addition to developing the knowledge of these learning strategies, there are these other 3 behaviors that I think really show that a learner has some level of autonomy. First one, we see the compass. We talk about goals. And what basically this means is that they know why they are learning and what they want to achieve. And that's going to be really important for the beginning of this process of working with our exam-oriented learners. The second thing that's really important is the reflection. A good habit and a good behavior of an independent and autonomous learner is that they can reflect on, they can evaluate their own performance objectively, and they can recognize their achievement, and they can identify areas of growth. And then finally, motivation, which is something that's been really, really difficult this year, hasn't it? Keeping motivated. Good autonomous learners, they're motivated, they're self-directed, they're responsible for their own learning, and they're independent. In other words, they can accept that they themselves are in charge of their learning and that they're responsible for making decisions about it. Okay, so we're going to look at these, and we're going to come up with some practical ideas for classroom use that A, raise learners' awareness of the need to take responsibility, and B, give them opportunities to try out different ways of doing this, all at the same time while giving them space to reflect and to decide upon their future approaches. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second and reflect back on something that Alberto talked about in his talk, when he was talking about the resources that Cambridge English make available, the vast gamut of resources that make available. I need you to do one thing today if you haven't yet done it, okay? You need to go to the Cambridge English website, as Alberto showed you, and download all the exam handbooks for the exams that you teach, okay? Because before you can even begin to think about helping your learners to fully understand how to go about learning in an exam-focused course, you need to fully understand the exam yourself. And you know, the handbook is the single best resource for this because it explains in detail the focus of each and every task and every paper and every exam. And you can follow the link that he gave you in his presentation, but I also have a link at the end of my presentation, which we'll be making available. So please do that. You cannot call yourself an exams teacher if you don't know about the exam and you haven't read carefully that exam handbook. It's full of really interesting information, all about the context of the exam, all about what happens, what specifically is being tested within the exam, what the focus is. It suggests techniques and strategies. It talks about assessment. So really, that's your homework. Do that today, please. Okay, so where were we? Autonomy, right? Okay, so I can kind of hear some comments in my head, right? It's basically this. Okay, you're teaching English. You see the learners, if you're lucky, a couple of times a week for an hour or 2 hours. How can you manage this, especially in this remote or hybrid environment? How can you manage this whilst doing all those things at the same time? How can you manage to help the students be autonomous and teach them at the same time in the restricted time you have? Well, it might seem like a big task, but in reality, it's a matter of building in a few small habits and creating clear expectations and communication with the students, and perhaps in a school time context with parents as well. Funnily enough, there are actually a very wide variety of approaches to working with autonomy. From all sorts of different perspectives. So if we look at those now, I'm sure that you're going to find at least one or two, if not more, which are going to suit the context in which you're working. The diagram shows the levels at which you can work with learner autonomy, okay? And as you can see, there are 6 basic methods. I'm not going to go into detail about them, except to gloss over each one. Curriculum-based approaches, they extend this idea that the learner can control the curriculum, so that the curriculum itself is designed with that in mind. And I can see that perhaps that in a school context, individual teachers perhaps don't have that ability or opportunity to work with that. Now, technology-based approaches, they emphasize the independent interaction with technologies. And that is something that we've learned an awful lot about over the last year, isn't it? There are so many more things we can actually do digitally and remotely that we couldn't do in our face-to-face classes, or we could add them to our face-to-face classes. And that's basically archiving. We can make a lot of use of resources for recording information about learners, and for learners themselves to actually record what they've achieved. Now, learner-based approaches, they focus on the production of behavioral or psychological changes in the learner, and that is kind of finding ways for the learners to create good strategies for learning. And you will not be surprised to hear that it's one of the things that I'm going to focus on in the rest of the talk. Classroom-based, teacher-based approaches, they're basically focusing on the teacher training, and also perhaps the teacher's beliefs about autonomy. That is something for your institution to work on, and also perhaps for you to work on if you can find some sources for you to really think about what your own attitudes are towards autonomy and how you believe autonomy works. And then finally, classroom-based approaches, these focus on learning control over the planning and the evaluation of the classroom learning. So that's very different to, say, the curriculum-based approach, which is the whole school. The classroom is focused on the environment of the classroom, and the learners actually working on that themselves. There is a very interesting school in São Paulo, in Santo Antônio do Pinhal, called Escola Lumiar. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it's basically what we might call a free school, I guess, if that's the right term. The learners have almost complete or equal control as the teachers over what happens in the classroom. But of course, I know that in most cases that's not going to be true for all of us. But it can actually involve simple things. For example, a choice of activities. Yeah, this by giving a choice of activities to the learners, you're actually handing over a little bit of control. And we mustn't forget that autonomy means control. So if you're the kind of teacher keep control of every single process, perhaps you need to relax a little bit and start handing over some of those things to your learners. Possible approaches. The first thing that you have to recognize is that which of these you have the ability to actually work with, or the opportunity to work with. Institutionally, as I said, perhaps you don't have a control over the curriculum decisions. But most teachers do have some level of independence when it comes to resources or focusing on the learners to develop their autonomy. And I think that's what is going to be the focus of what we're going to be talking about now. Okay. Now we're going to do that by applying some concrete ideas from these approaches. Remember, the approaches related to classroom-based or learner-based or resources-based. We're going to take some ideas from the approaches and we're going to apply them to these behaviors. Do you remember what the behaviors are? We have the compass, we have the map, we have the scales, and we have what seems to be somebody climbing to the top of a mountain. Could you put in the chat, please, what each of these might relate to? So first, the compass, what does that relate to? This is a good test to see if you've been paying attention. Yeah, the compass relates to goals, the ability to set goals and the ability to evaluate performance. The map relates to the ability to form strategies. The scales, these relate to the ability to reflect upon one's own performance. Yeah, awesome, brilliant. And finally, the last one relates to motivation, which is actually a very big area, and it's not simply down to motivation, but we're using that as a shortcut, okay? So we're going to look at these in turn, and we're going to come up with some practical ideas for classroom use that A, raise the learner's awareness of the need to take responsibility, and B, give them opportunities to try out different ways of doing this, yeah? Because experimentation is really, really important for you to be able to reflect and decide which of those suit you or not. So we're going to start with goals, yeah? Now it's the perennial question that we always ask, and sometimes the answer is not always satisfactory. Why is the learner learning English? Now for school-age learners, that's often a matter of, well, I'm doing it because it's there, okay? But what's really important is that we help the student to concretize more clearly why they're learning English, okay? And perhaps that's where an exam-orientated learner has an advantage over a general English learner in that they have at least a short-term specific exam goal, okay? But even then, I think a specific exam goal is good, but perhaps not clear enough. So, for example, can we help the students to have a concrete reason for doing the exam? What would be the advantage of doing key, preliminary first, advanced, proficiency, or IELTS? Just doing it because you, the teacher, told them to do it, or doing it because their parents told them to do it, that's not going to be very motivating, isn't it? That's lack of control, which is the enemy of autonomy. So you need to set the reasons in real, specific context of their lives. Now, if you work in a school, then your school should also be finding reasons why the learners are going to benefit from gaining the certificate. And of course, related to the Cambridge exams, Cambridge English themselves can help out, right, Alberto? There are lots of webinars, talks, and as you know, Alberto and other people who work for Cambridge Assessment will actually come along and give talks related to this. So, you know, lack of resources, there are plenty of resources out there. Okay, but in order to help the students set their own goals, it's important to encourage them to assess their current knowledge of the language, yeah? We need to know a start point, so it's between the now and the goal. If they don't have this ability properly, they're going to create some very far-fetched objectives. So, for example, there are learners who get their heads obsessed with they're going to get an A in CPE, for example. And we know that that's actually really, really difficult. To help and coach them to actually reassess and reset learning goals throughout their language learning life. And as Alberto just mentioned, there is actually can-do summaries which are going to help them break down their goals into smaller, digestible bites. Yeah. Okay. So, as I just mentioned, I think this snapshot of where they are now is really, really important, and we want to encourage them to look at that. So we want to devise something that helps them to realistically look at their strengths and their weaknesses and what they can do at the moment. Okay. And that can be in terms of the level of their language, their abilities to maximize their study opportunities, or even their understanding of the exam. And the activity I'm about to suggest can be done at any time, although if you want to focus on an exam, for example, the learners do need to have some basic understanding of the exam itself. Now, this activity, you can actually do it once only if you wish, but I would suggest that you do it a few times over the year in order to kind of have a milestone for them to reflect on each time they do it. And this activity is very organic, and it can actually tie in with further work on specific can-do goals that the students can be working towards. The activity, it's basically a radar activity, and it's something that can actually start a very rich discussion between the students and between you and the students. And this is actually adapted from Meddings with rubric Teaching Unplugged, which I know at least Fabrizio Cruz has no doubt read from cover to cover because he loves Dog Me. Basically, it's this. You draw a shape on your board, your online board, your face-to-face board. The shape itself doesn't need to be the shape that I've got here. The shape itself needs to have the number of points, the number of angles on it that you're going to focus on. So, for example, in this one, because it's a pentagon, I'm going to focus on points. But if you want to focus on 4 points, you use a square or a triangle. If you want to focus on 3 points, use a rectangle, not a triangle. Sorry, I'm getting my shapes mixed up. So whatever shape you want, that's the number of points you're going to have. Now, the topics I'm going to use are going to be basically related to the exam, an exam like Cambridge First, the B2 exam. But they could be anything, seriously. They could be like specific language skills. It could be related to units of a course book you're working on. It could be related to study opportunities or study time. It could be also almost anything that you feel is relevant to the learners at that point. And what you do is you provide a copy of this to the learners. The diagram itself, it can be digital. It's better because then you have it in a Google Doc. You have access to it. The students have access to it for constant reference. Okay, and basically you ask the students to write in the topics that you're going to focus on, and in this case, as I mentioned, they all relate to either a paper from the B2 or at least a split paper when it comes to reading use of English. And then what you do is you ask the learners to place dots on the lines that come from the center to the points. Where they place the line depends on how they feel. So the further away from the center the dot is, the more confident, the more motivated, the more sure the learners feel about those points. So in this case, we have the 5 dots, and in this case, the speaker, the learner is not so confident about speaking, which is a very common thing. Yeah, often learners are less confident about their speaking than they are perhaps about their reading. So we ask them to put the dots, and then we ask them to draw lines between those dots, and that gives us a little radar map of how the students or the learners themselves are feeling about the areas of language or the areas of the exam that they want to work on. Okay, now this itself might take 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how much thinking. The more valuable thing is what comes next. Okay, you can work with it in varying ways. Okay, this is the way I like to work with it. Put the learners in small groups or breakout rooms. Each learner takes their turn to talk about their radar map, why they've decided to put the dots in those places. And whilst the others are listening, they need to be coming up with suggestions and ideas for the speaker about how to get one or more of those dots further towards the edge. In case speaking would be a good idea to explore why the learner is feeling less confident, get the other students to give ideas about what they could do to make that better. Okay, now each learner then can present their findings, so giving the ideas that others suggested and also assessing whether or not they think those ideas will be doable for them. But if you don't have the classroom time for that, you can actually skip straight to the next point, where you can ask each learner to use this discussion and the diagram to basically create a plan with very specific time-limited actions to move that dot. Okay, so let's say the speaking person, they're having issues perhaps with, they feel confident because they find it difficult to find words, all right? One of their plans could be to work on automaticity or fluency, and this could involve repeated recordings of them doing a specific speaking task in order to review and revise and reflect on their performance in order to make their speaking a little bit more automatic, okay? And they could say, I'm going to record myself 2 times over weeks, and then we have this plan, okay? Now, you can check on a plan at regular intervals with the student, yeah? You can ask them how they're doing, if they've managed to do it, and we'll see later on, you can actually create checklists for reflection so they can actually fully focus on their plan and how they've been progressing. This plan, the crucial result of this plan is not just the concrete plan of study, okay? That's a really important thing. But the other really important thing is that you're growing the students' awareness about their responsibility for their own learning and that their progress is in their hands. Kind of trying to hand over and make explicit that, in a sense, this is a partnership. You, the teacher, are guiding them and giving them all the tools necessary in order to improve and progress. Responsibility for this lies in their hands. And this is one of the crucial goals of autonomy. Yeah, the students themselves need to take control of their learning, and this is an activity which can help you to kind of make that explicit. Okay, let's move on to strategies. Now, learning how to learn is actually something that occurs naturally, but perhaps it might take longer or have more false starts if you let it go organically and naturally. I'm a good case in point, yeah, related to Portuguese. I never really had formal lessons in Portuguese. I had a week or 2 right at the beginning of my arrival in Brazil. But most of my learning has been a bit organic, listening to radio, not formally studying. And so I have managed to learn how to be okay in Portuguese, but it's probably taking me much, much longer than if I had a good teacher who was able to show me the path forward. Yeah, and so we can help our learners to find shortcuts and to understand how they themselves best learn by working through learning strategies with them. And I'm going to focus on 3 of these learning strategies, okay, which I'm sure that all of you are going to recognize from any previous reading or study that you've been doing. Firstly, cognitive learning strategies, yeah? These are basically the strategies that the learner employs to address a task, yeah, an activity or some material. For example, in the open-close activity, in the B1, B2, etc. exams, what is the strategy? It's basically to read the whole text, to read the sentence where the gap is, to understand the kinds of words around the gap, and to understand the meaning of the gap and the part of speech in the gap. Yeah. So the strategy is to look at those and try to narrow down what the option might be in the gap. All right. And this is something that we can actually work on with our students. Now, the thing about cognitive learning strategies is that they are incredibly varied. So each task or skill requires a whole range of them. So it's really important that you encourage them to develop like a repertoire that they can retrieve and access when they need them. Yeah, and that's really, really important, is that they know that they can access them when they need them, and they don't have to slavishly follow them. The other kind of strategy is metacognitive learning strategies. And these are the ones basically where it's kind of the guard standing over the cognitive learning strategies, the ability to make sure that the cognitive strategies are working. It's like thinking about how to think. And if we take the same example, the open close, yeah, metacognitive strategies would include you've tried a way of doing it, you reflect upon its effectiveness, whether or not you manage to reach a full understanding or not of missing word. So it's an opportunity for the learner to reflect upon which cognitive strategies worked and which of them didn't work. and how they might be able to improve those skills in the future. The third one is socio-affective learning strategies. This is really related to feelings like stress, frustration, anxiety, motivation, fear, all those things involved when learning a new language. Now, these are really important because they're based on the idea that the positive environment is essential for learning. Yeah. So in the classroom, you, the teacher, are clearly responsible for the environment of the learning, for leading by your example, by letting the students understand that frustration, anxiety, fear, these are all common and valid feelings when it comes to learning English, and especially when it comes to working towards exams. Now, the challenge perhaps for most teachers is making these things explicit for the learners. It's not always easy. And to help the students develop these kind of socio-affective learning strategies, the teacher needs to encourage them to monitor their level of anxiety when approaching certain tasks, for example, in the exam. Another example at work is to see the difference between working alone and working collaboratively. Working collaboratively, if you've organized the activities and the groupings well, actually can reduce anxiety and can help learners to reflect upon how the process of learning is going with them. Okay, so these are the basic strategies, and we're going to look at all three and give some practical ideas for each of them. Okay. Now, in my opinion, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, strategies are probably the most important thing when it comes to working with exams, in addition to, of course, the language learning. The learners need to feel sure that they're able to learn. Yeah, they need to enter the exam room with confidence, and they need to know what to expect from the exam and how to approach each paper and each task. So let's look at some of these practical ideas at all three levels. Again, all of them exam specific, not related to general language learning. Okay, firstly, staged practice. Okay, basically this is when we give the students not only practice tasks, but we break it down into stages, yeah? And we draw attention to the task requirements and also the task strategies. You can do this with your own practice materials, yeah, course books. So basically what you can do is you can guide the students to use their current knowledge to identify the context, the meaning, and the part of speech in the open-close task I mentioned before. So you can take it one step at a time. Yeah? Draw attention to the title of the text. You can ask prediction questions about the task, about the text, and that enables them to activate their knowledge about the topic and kind of come to predict the kind of language they're going to see. You can then ask them to read very quickly the text itself. This gives them a general understanding of the text, and that makes it much easier when they need to identify specific points in the text. It's very, very important that they do that. The next thing, of course, you ask them to focus on the specific gaps, to look at the meaning of the gap first, and then perhaps look at the part of speech of the gap first, secondly, before arriving at the actual word that might go in the gap. So, these are things that you can do at any moment working with the materials that you do. At the very beginning, it's really important that you break it down. Perhaps then on, for later on, you can give them a little bit less. You can ask them to review or revise the process until they themselves are doing this almost automatically. And that's our aim, is that these strategies become automatic processes. But there are actually some fantastic resources out there, and you don't always have to do it all yourself. And that's the great thing. And I'm going to come back again. I'm doing a lot of advertising for Alberto at the moment, so I expect the payment to be very good. We're talking about Cambridge English exams, yeah? So what better place than the Cambridge English site itself? There are actually hundreds of ready-made lesson plans. I think it's at least 20 lesson plans per paper, per exam, if not more for some of the more extended exams. And there are other resources for you to work on, specifically related to cognitive learning strategies. Again, the link that Alberto gave, or the link at the end of this presentation, will guide you there. So, for example, the lesson plan for the first open-close task does exactly what I just said. It's designed to A, help them understand the focus of the task, what kind of things are being tested, and also, what are the most common kind of items that are tested in open close at B2. And it also deals with a possible strategy to work with the task. Yeah, so these lesson plans are broken down stage by stage, so you don't have to worry about creating the whole lesson plan yourself. So if you actually work on these initially with the students as a kind of initial exposure to the papers, tasks in the exam, it's going to go a long way towards helping them become aware of the possible strategies. And then later on, you can reinforce those strategies when you feel that students need this reinforcement or they're struggling perhaps with some specific items. But something that's really important is when it comes to task strategies, you have to remember something really, really important. The learners, they go about the tasks in their own way. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it, okay? If they're getting consistently good scores in any practice test or any task that you give them, don't insist that they do it your way, yeah? Because this is going to create a break in their strategies, and perhaps it's going to make the situation worse. The important thing is to remember the strategy is the resource, yeah? And the resource is there to use when the learner either has very little understanding of the requirements or as a kind of emergency plan B, if the answer is not immediately obvious to them. So what I do, for example, I tell my students, you're doing the open close. If you don't know the answer within 5 seconds, move on. Less than 5 seconds, move on, okay? Because there are going to be easier options later on. If when you've got to the end, then you go back and then you can apply the strategies, okay? Explicitly to break down and understand what might go in the gap, or at least minimize or maximize your chance of getting the right answer. Okay, so leave the automatic processes to do their job and bring in the strategies when you need a little bit of extra help to focus on things that you're finding difficult. Vivian, I just saw in the chat that Vivian Pretends wrote that the plans are really useful because they can help teachers get a better understanding of the tasks. Absolutely. Yeah, so you yourselves, even if you look at them yourselves as teachers and don't pass them on to the students, that's really going to help you understand the exam tasks themselves, yeah? But I wonder if many of you have been using these kind of lesson plans, or if you've ever come across them at all. Do you want to make a comment in the chat if you've actually found them useful? So, I mean, if you haven't yet come across them or used them or seen them, again, that's another piece of homework for you, okay? In addition to downloading the handbooks for each exam, you should download at least one lesson plan for each of the exams that you teach so you can actually see how actually useful they are. Okay? So, let's move on. Further strategies related to the exam tasks. And these are DIY tasks. It's very simple to actually take an existing text and ask the learners to work in groups to create a task for another group. Yeah, these are DIY exam tasks. And learners actually love the opportunity to test their colleagues. And they do sometimes like to make one or two things very hard for their colleagues as a way of tricking them. And why not? You know, if it makes it fun, that's a good thing. It's especially useful to do these key kind of DIY tasks for use of English tasks, open close, multiple choice close, word formation, etc. But it actually also works for listening and reading, although it may take a little bit more preparation, yeah? Now, basically, you take a text, and they can come from different sources. One good, clever cheating option, perhaps, would be to take an existing task, let's say from a practice test book. And then what you have to do is you have to get the practice test task, and you actually need to fill in all the gaps, okay? It doesn't mean that you need to type it out or scan it or have an electronic version of it. And basically what you do is you have the text complete with all gaps. And that's what you can use to ask the students to actually create their own tasks. The other sources you could use I think for B1 and B2, I would recommend the BBC News website because it's a good option in terms of the level that's appropriate for those levels. The BBC News website is interesting because the level of the language, I would say, is relatively simple. None of the sentences are really long and complex. So these are good sources for the kind of lower to mid-range CFR levels. But if we're talking about things like C1 and above, then I think perhaps more sophisticated sites like The Economist or the Guardian newspaper or the Telegraph newspaper or whatever kind of more sophisticated journal that you know of has the right level of language for you. Okay. Now, so imagine this is a situation. You created your text. As we're teaching remotely, yeah, you have that text in a shared Google Doc. You have enough text to share with the groups that you decided to have. So if you have 3 groups, you need 3 texts. All right. You share the texts with the groups. You give them a specific amount of time in order to work through and find the right kind of gaps, to remove some of the words, make a note of the original answers. And basically what you want to do is to make sure you monitor what they're doing so you can guide them, because sometimes they do make choices that are a bit difficult, or they make choices that are perhaps a bit beyond the level. So in order to do this activity, you really do need to have a good feel of the kind of demands of the specific level and the specific task, right? As I say, it's really easy to run online. You have shared documents, you can monitor, you can comment, and then the other groups can access the tasks from the other groups and actually work with them. Now, I found this process very, very interesting because the act of creating a task gives a much deeper understanding of the demands of the task itself, like the requirements, what kind of words are the target. And it also encourages them to have a deeper thinking about the structure of language itself. Yeah, if you're deciding whether or not to have a gap, you need to think about the cognitive processes of the person looking at the sentence and looking at the gap and how they're going to arrive at their answer. So this is something I would recommend that you do perhaps mid-stage of the learner's journey towards the exams. Yeah, you do initially the exposure to stage practice so they have a fuller understanding of the way the tasks work, and then you actually move on to creating DIY tasks for them, which are, they are really fun, really enjoyable, and the learners learn a great deal about the exam by doing that. Okay. Now, whatever activities you run with the learners, always give them time and space to reflect on the usefulness of what they've just done, yeah? Very, really important. You can guide them with simple, concrete questions. It could be verbally or it could be written down. Questions like, what do you know now that you didn't know before about the task or about the language? Do you think you'll use this strategy in the future? Why? Why not? And then perhaps, do you think this is useful to do with other people, or do you think it would be useful for you to try to do these kind of activities alone? Why not? Yeah, so it's really important that after each of these kind of activities that you do with the learners, they do get a chance to actually think about what they've just done, because that's in order for students to assess their own learning and the usefulness of it to become autonomous, they do need this space. So don't rush headlong into the next task, okay? Always leave a few minutes to pause and to reflect. Now, exam anxieties, again, this is all related to strategies still, yeah? These are the socio-affective strategies. Anxieties can come from a number of sources, yeah? Related to exams, it can come from fear of failure, it's obvious, yeah? Or it might be difficulty working under pressure or under timed pressure. There may be other sources of anxiety, yeah? Personal life, family life, all sorts, personal, psychological type, many types of anxiety that can come about. But clearly, one of the solutions to anxiety is obviously becoming increasingly confident with the language demands of the level, feeling that you are of the level and that you deserve your place there. But also they need the opportunity to feel comfortable with the task and perhaps the timing of the task. And this is where timed practice is really important. So ample timed practice, and not simply just practice, is a really important feature of trying to overcome any kind of anxieties. Now, you could work in increments, yeah? So, for example, at the beginning, when the learners are relatively new to the kind of demands of the exam, you can negotiate the timing of the task with them. And of course, it doesn't have to be an exam task. You don't have to really only work with exam tasks to start working on timing. It can be any kind of activity, a coursebook task, a worksheet that you give them, an online resource, anything. So you negotiate the timing, you kind of manage that, you work with that, you agree a specific time, and then you make them stop after the time that's finished. But then what you want to do is you want to slowly decrease the time available to them until it fits the exam requirements. Yeah. Now, one of the problems with this is that exact timings are learner dependent. Yeah. Somebody who can do a gapped text, for example, might take just a few minutes. Another learner will take 5 minutes. Other learner will perhaps take 10 minutes. So it's really important that you keep checking with them about how long it takes them and ask them to make a note of how long it's taken them to do this specific task, okay? And then later, you can kind of ask them to create their own personal timing guide per paper. Yeah, you can provide an outline timing guide and ask them to modify it. Yeah, but basically these then can be used when you're practicing a whole paper. I personally would even allow them to have that at the side when they're doing one of the very first practices of the exam, okay, of the whole paper. They have the timing guide to guide them so that they know when to move on and when to give a little bit more time to a task, yeah. And then after that, you can ask them to reflect on the timing and modify the timings until they feel that they know the best way and the best time of doing that paper, yeah. And I think this sense of control and familiarity is going to be the thing that really helps reduce anxiety. Yeah, we often feel anxious about very many different situations because we don't feel that we're in control. Yeah, as I mentioned before, is a really, really important element of autonomy. Okay, let's move on to reflection. Now, autonomous learners should be able to assess themselves, identify their strengths and weaknesses, as I mentioned when talking about goals. Now, the teachers you can help your learners to self and peer assess by providing them with opportunities to use a variety of self-assessment tools. And they might include some of the things that Alberto already mentioned. They might include things like creating and keeping portfolios. Now, more than ever, portfolios are actually very easy to keep because they can be kept online in a folder in a Google Drive, for example. They keep their portfolios as speaking and writing because it allows them to look and see their progress and actually provides evidence for further goal making. Yeah, digital portfolios can be fully commented by the teacher. Google Docs or other kinds of documents. They can be audio recordings, video recordings of the learn and speaking production. And a portfolio is a really good way of kind of looking at where you've come from, where you are now, and thinking about where you want to go. That's a really, really important opportunity for reflection. Another way is perhaps self-assessment questionnaires. And I know these are quite common. They can include questions about understanding of specific language points, how satisfied the learner is with their own dedication all the time. Now, normally, these are not yes/no questions, okay? They're normally numerical, or they have a gradient, or they use various emoticons to show how the student feels about that point, so that the learner's not presented with binary like, I'm good, I'm bad, yeah? It could be, I'm very happy, I'm quite happy, okay, not so good, very unhappy, yeah? And then they can locate themselves, and that encourages them to think about how they've been approaching their learning or how they feel about specific aspects of their learning in a way which allows them to ponder upon the next steps. Another possibility, which Alberto mentioned as well, is related to checklist. Yes, for monitoring your learning aims. Checklists can come, because if we're talking about an exam, they come from exterior sources, where the can-do checklists can be used by the learners to actually make sure that they can achieve those various items on the list, or they can be done by the students themselves. Yeah, if a student decides that they are going to have this plan for these 5, 6, 7 weeks, then they can create a little checklist which allows them to tick off the list. You know how satisfying it is. Yeah, you tick off a list. I did it. I'm managing. So it's actually very useful for them to keep track of where they're going, and it's an additional motivation. And talking about motivation, that's our last topic. Okay. Remember, the successful autonomous learner is self-directed, independent, responsible, all of which create and reinforce motivation. Yeah. Now, what are the opposites of these things? What is the opposite of self-directed? What is the opposite of independent? What is the opposite of responsible? Self-directed could be other-directed. So it's not the learner themselves who are directing their learning, it's the teacher, it's the parent. Or it could be, and I'm sure you've all come across learners like this, it could be like aimless. The student doesn't know where they are, where they're going, why they're there. All right. The clear opposite of independent is dependent on others. Yeah. And the opposite of responsible is irresponsible. Now, that's a very strong term, but what I mean here is that it's an attitude which seems to show that the student doesn't understand or care about their own state and their own progress in relation to their learning. Okay, I don't mean it in that big general sense of doing things which are actually very bad. All right. Now, let's be clear, these things don't come from English class, do they? They come from the whole context of the learner, their upbringing, their parents, their social status, the other workload they have, just to name a few of them. But where you can help related to all of these things by having clear expectations and communicating when you feel that those things are not being met, and offering ideas and suggestions to the learner about how they might improve that area. The other thing that's really important that you do is that you identify and celebrate all the victories. So a learner has created a learning plan, they managed to achieve 50% of it, 60% of it, you cheer them on, yeah? You point it out to their colleagues, yeah? Remember, we always praise in public, but we criticize in private, and that's a really important aspect of respect for the learner. What's also really important is that you actually break down all of your teaching into manageable steps with clear goals and reasons for doing things, yeah? And that could go a long way to create the important habit of being more autonomous, because these habits we mentioned before, goals, strategies, reflection, they can only occur if the student is motivated and has this sense of direction, a sense of growing independence, and a sense of growing responsibility. Now, if you do things without knowing why, this can be really frustrating, and you know that it's true in life. If you've ever been asked to do anything just because, you know how you want to tear your hair out when you hear that. Yeah? One of the fundamental things to foster learning autonomy is to share with the students the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. Yeah. And also the rationale behind the activities, provide them with choices whenever possible. Autonomous learners should participate in the decision-making process when it comes to their own learning. Okay, but I'm not suggesting, of course, that you're handing over everything to them. The students are not ready for that. They don't have those abilities. You're there to guide and help them with that. But it can be something simple, like for homework, choose activity A or activity. Giving them a choice, you're giving them a much greater sense of self-autonomy, that they can make decisions for themselves. And without it, we're not going to grow autonomous learner. Okay, phew. We're coming to the end now. But we do need to go back to the beginning. Remember, I asked what this photograph showed, and some of you had an idea. Some of you said another planet. Some of you said the moon. But some of you knew exactly what it was because you had been catching up on the news recently, yeah? But I also asked you how this is related to learner autonomy. Okay, so let's deal with those two things. What is it first? This is a photo of the wheel on NASA's Perseverance rover. Okay, this rover is huge. It's the size of a family car, 2 meters by 3 meters, and it weighs over 1,000 kilograms. It has its own built-in helicopter, believe it or not, like a drone that can detach and survey the land around it. And it landed on the surface of Mars just last week. Yeah, 8 days ago. And the job of this rover, this huge monster, is to crawl across the surface of Mars and try to work on the geology and the climates of the planet, perhaps with the eye on the possibility that life existed on Mars in the past. Okay, so that's the job. Now, here's the thing. This is not a remote controlled toy. It has to be autonomous, okay? It takes 11 minutes and 22 seconds for radio signals to travel between Mars and Earth and vice versa, okay? So imagine you send a signal to the rover, it takes 11 minutes, 22 seconds to get there. And if you want to hear the response, if it's immediate, you're going to get it 11 minutes and 22 seconds later. So imagine trying to drive this remotely. It's impossible, yeah? You send a signal to turn left, and you don't know the result of that until 23 minutes later. Imagine trying to drive that way, drive your car. You're driving down Huaquinzi or near the center of town, yeah? You make a maneuver to park, and you only know where you've got to after 23 minutes. I think there will be a lot of crashes, okay? So the rover has an autonomous driving system, a little bit like the Tesla cars, yeah? And it allows it to judge, survey, and judge the terrain and plot its best course from one location to another. Perseverance, this rover, is the perfect metaphor for your learners because you can't steer them all the time, okay? At some point, they're going to be out of communication range and they're going to have to guide themselves because the time will come when they're going to be alone and the teacher's not going to be there looking over their shoulder. Help your learners on that road to autonomy, the better they're going to be able to, at the very least, pass those exams, all right? But you know, and that's the great thing about being a teacher, is that all those lessons will carry them forward throughout life and they will become adaptable, responsible, independent human beings. And that is something that is very, very important and something of which we can be very, very proud. Okay, thank you. I am going to open up space for questions if there are any. Again, I'd like to thank Santo Anjo and Cultura Inglesa for inviting me, and I'd like to thank all of you for your presence and your participation. Please get in touch with me by email or by WhatsApp if you wish to discuss any of these issues further, or if you want to talk about my individual or group training courses for teachers and their schools, I'm also available. For example, I'll be running a course on teaching for exams in the second semester of this year, as well as providing packages for teachers, for schools wishing to become prep centers for Cambridge exams. As I mentioned before, there is going to be a PDF available, and it's actually already there. So there's the bit.ly link. Okay, I can't afford tiny CC, unfortunately. This one's free, but there is also a QR code there if you wish. I'm going to leave that up just for a minute or two. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to look at them in the chat. You're welcome, Leonardo, and you're welcome, Colégio Santo Anjo, whoever you are. If you don't have any questions or comments now, I'd be more than happy to hear them independently. So you can send me a WhatsApp message or you can send me an email. And I'm more than happy to receive feedback as well. So if you have any comments about the pace or any comments about the content, I welcome them with open arms.
So this is the end of our first online event, and we'd like to thank Alberto and Dennis again for sharing their knowledge and their time with us. Thanks to Cambridge Assessment English for the support, and thank you all for joining us today. You will receive your certificate soon by mail. Hope to see you again. Bye bye.